You're listening to Convenience Matters, brought to you by NACS. Whether it's for food, fuel, drinks, or snacks, about half the U.S. population shops at a convenience store every day. We'll talk about what we see at stores and what the future may hold for our industry.
Welcome to Convenience Matters. My name is Jeff Lenard with NACS.
And I am Donovan Woods with Fuels Institute and NACS. Happy to be here, Jeff.
Well, Donovan, we've talked a lot about the intersection between transportation and convenience. And I think what we'd like to explore today is the whole concept of where it intermingles not just with fuels, but with fueling and recharging. And specifically, the whole idea of convenience charging. And how does that apply at stores or elsewhere? And today, our guest is Erika Meyers. She's with SEPA. Is that right? SEPA?
Yep. SEPA. Smart Electric Power Alliance.
And I just want to make sure it wasn't SEPA or something like that, because in D.C., everything's an acronym, and so sometimes that gets a little confusing. But welcome, Erika. And we'd like to have a discussion about what the future is with electric vehicles and where do convenience stores fit in with charging.
And the cool thing is, Jeff, that we've actually had Erika here before, and it was definitely one of my personal favorite podcasts. I'm not saying that because she's sitting right here in front of me, but more so because the report and how I found her and how she was willing to come in and do the podcast. And I think our listeners, a high download rate on this one, they want to know. And she has all of the answers, I think, to all the questions we have. And the report I'm referencing is the SEPA report entitled Utilities and Electric Vehicles Evolving to Unlock Grid Value. I'm excited to talk to you, Erika, and I'd love to know, maybe you can set us up. I know there are 3 stages when it comes to utilities. There's the early stage, intermediate stage, and late stage. Can you tell our audience really what those mean, and that'll kind of set the foundation for our discussion?
Sure, absolutely. So we did this report last year, or most of the research last year. We published it in March. And what we found were basically 3 stages. Just like a walk, jog, run sort of evolution. We see early, intermediate, and late stage activities by utilities. Early stage is really where utilities getting to know the technology. They're experimenting with their own fleets. They're using their own employees to kind of test some things out. And then intermediate is where they're starting to engage with their customers. New rate designs, incentives, grants, things like that help their customers get acclimated or the infrastructure that they need for electric vehicles. The late stage would be really where they're leveraging these technologies to use them for grid benefit. So things like managed charging or vehicle to grid, where they can take that energy from the vehicle itself and help supplement the grid.
So when we look at the early or late adoption, we look at the grid, and the grid is kind of tapped right now, and we're talking about a massive increase in terms of potential use of the grid. So how do we manage that? I know a couple of years ago you heard discussions like the grid can't support it, and now the discussion is we're looking at things differently. It's not as linear as the discussions from a few years ago. It can work. Can you talk about some of the ways that it can work as electrification of vehicles becomes more popular?
Sure, absolutely. So as we mentioned on the last podcast, we actually have a surplus of energy capacity in this country. And that's by law, regulations and requirements among utilities to have surplus for certain events where there may be more demand than there is at any other times of the year. So we actually do have the power available to electrify vehicles today. The bigger question is, what time are those vehicles going to be charging? And if it's during peak hours, that can get very expensive very quickly and impact the rate base for all customers. So the idea being that we integrate these vehicles in a way that will maximize energy usage during the cheapest hours of the day and encouraging customers to charge off-peak or in these windows when we have high solar penetration or high wind penetration, which is when we get some of the cheapest electrons.
And also related to that, is there a matter of teaching people not just, I think the traditional model is people come home, they plug in, or they get to work, they plug in, and it's 8 hours or 10 hours or 12 hours, whatever that time frame is till the next use your car. Is there also a process where people are looking at shorter charges because the charge rate is either faster or it doesn't have to go from 0 to 100? It could be percent charge. It could be some increment or something like that. Are there any new developments related to what's going on with how people might charge differently?
So there's a lot of evidence showing, at least for the earliest adopters of this technology, that long duration charging has been the preferred resource. Now, as we start getting into the mass market, that could change, right? We might have a new demographic of users that prefers that quicker charge. So it's still to be determined whether or not the future will continue with long duration, or if we'll have what's known as the gas station model, which is the quicker charge and more convenient charge, according to some customers. So that is still a big question mark, and there's a lot of people who believe strongly one way or the other.
Now, you mentioned convenience stores, so I'll jump right in on that one since that's our primary audience. Is there a way that these retailers could actually help solve the infrastructure problem? Is there a way they could play a role in that?
Absolutely. So when we think about where people know to fuel today,
Right.
if they saw, oh, my gas station that I go to on a regular basis also has a charger, maybe then they would see that this conversion to this new fuel source won't be so insurmountable, right? It's also potentially an educational opportunity to showcase that there is another fuel that is out there. There are lots of studies showing that consumer education is one of the biggest barriers to EV right now, electric vehicle.
And I'm somehow going to tie this to beer, and it may not make sense, but it does. Visited a convenience store, and they have growlers and crowlers where they have, you can take home beer that they pour there, and they put it in a jug, and it's sealed, and you take it home. And they have some specialty brews that are very unique to the area. They don't have, they're too small batch to even be cans or bottles that you buy at a supermarket, for instance. And they use this app called Tap Hunter, and they sign up, and these people find out when their favorite beer is available. And this retailer said the quickest they sold out was 57 minutes. They send out a signal, and people know, and they show up. Can we do something? Here's the connection to EVs. Can something be done somewhat similar with an app or something like that? Or maybe it already exists for retailers. So if they have, say, 4 chargers, it says, this one's available, because probably the biggest frustration is if you have an electric vehicle and you need a sip, you show up somewhere and somebody has that sip. So is there the ability to maybe be more interactive with electric vehicle owners, the retailer to the electric vehicle owner, to say, hey, I'm here for you, and by the way, we might have a discount on a sandwich or something like that if you'd like to hang out for a bit?
I think that's a great idea. Hey, you could also even get a discount on your beer if you go charge. I love that idea too.
Tie it all.
I definitely think that that's a possibility of being able to show real-time usage of a particular charger. Absolutely. I think that capability exists in a lot of the chargers today. So making that information available to customers, and not just maybe on the app for that convenience store, but make it part of a broader network that a lot of these users already utilize on a day-to-day basis, could be very, very helpful. I think the other thing too that I love about this gas station idea is we're used to and accustomed to prices changing on a very regular basis at gas stations, right? I've seen gas stations change like 10 prices a day, maybe even more. And so in actual energy markets is very similar. Is the wholesale power prices change on a minute to 15 minute to an hourly basis. And that's not reflected in your bill because all you see is a flat rate per kilowatt hour, which is the average price over the course of an entire year. If we were to potentially provide that more dynamic rate pricing to a customer where they could say, hey, I can charge for 10 cents right now, or I could wait and charge at 5 cents later in the day, then you can help influence their behavior for charging with those real-time prices, much more similar to what we see today at gas stations or convenience stores. So I think that there's a lot of lessons our industry, the utility industry, could learn from the convenience store industry.
And the beer industry.
And the beer
Always.
industry.
Always.
Absolutely.
Erica, I have like at least 20 questions I wanted to ask you, but I think the nicest thing to do would be to ask my guest, tell me something about the report, because I want people to go read it. It's actually a very easy to understand and easy download. What did we miss last time? What is something interesting that's happening that you think everyone needs to know?
Sure. So I feel like we covered the report pretty well last time. A couple of things, new developments since the report was published that I just wanted to highlight are related to the number of utility EV filings that have happened since the report was published.
Now, what does that mean?
So sorry. Yeah. So for those of us that are in this space, utility files with a regulatory commission to do certain things. Pilot programs or full-blown programs all have to be approved by regulatory commissioners as prudent and best practices for that utility or for that state. And so when utilities are starting to endeavor to build out their own charging infrastructure or create electric vehicle programs for their customers and they spend dollars, they have to get that approved. And so what we've seen approved so far up to this point is $1 billion across the country in utility electric vehicle programs. This includes incentives, ownership of those chargers themselves or with third parties, education for customers, and also rate design. We have another $1 billion in pending filings. This would lead to another 84,000 level 2 chargers, over 500 DC fast chargers, which would essentially double that first investment.
Now, I don't know if you can talk about the specifics, but does that mean it's happening in one particular area of the country?
This is everywhere.
Okay.
Across the entire country.
Okay. All right.
And earlier I talked about apps. And to a certain extent, it feels that some of the things going on with smartphones are really what's taken off in the general technology realm because people have their phones in their pockets, or at least a sizable percentage do. Are there any things going on related to how phones work, whether one of the things that you don't have to necessarily be hardwired anymore with phones to charge them. You stick them on a device or something like that. Can things like that be done with the grid in looking at what you might do with vehicles? Yeah,
absolutely. So what you're talking about is wireless charging. Wireless charging is also known as inductive charging, which is where a car pulls over what's essentially a pad, and the energy is sent through resonance to that battery pack in the car. And we've seen approval of standards that enable auto manufacturers today to install that technology in vehicles. And now we're starting to see companies like Witricity who are making actual offerings for this technology at a pretty competitive price, about $1,500 to $2,000 for a level 2 charger that essentially frees you from having to plug in to your car. Now, where even more interesting is this idea of autonomous vehicles, right? So these are driverless cars that may at some point in the future hit our streets in DC or other places. And they're being piloted in some places like San Francisco today. And what these cars could do is essentially avoid having to have that human interface to charge. They could go to these wireless charging pads at strategic locations around the city, get that quick charge, could even be at a convenience store, and then keep going on their route.
That's super cool. I never even thought of that. That's really melding two of the big trends that are going on in industry, because you think about how do the autonomous vehicles fuel, and you might need a human somewhere along the way. But the idea that they just go to their pad, they recharge, they hang out, and then they move again, that feels much more like the future is happening sooner than later. And never even thought of that idea. I think that's a pretty cool thing.
Now, I know SEPA used to be called something else, and I don't want to go back to the past and rename what that was, but is there anything that you feel like you've learned from the solar industry in terms of how quickly things can change, technology can change, that utilities are implementing, or that as an association you try to make them aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. So we think of ourselves as helping electric utilities understand new technologies such as distributed energy resources that will play an important role on the grid. Maybe not as a robust role as we have today with traditional resources, but eventually in the future, the idea being that they will be as robust, if not equally robust, as traditional. So what we do to help them understand that is things like these reports that we are talking about today. And we also are looking closely at best practices, program design, utility business models that will interface with these technologies so that utilities and the consumers can both benefit. A lot of this is being driven by customers. Customers want different things. They want solar on their house. They want energy storage in their garage. They want an electric vehicle because it's cheaper and it's quieter and it's more convenient. And it's faster and it's more fun, right? So the utilities are responding to all of these customer needs and trying to do it in a way that also doesn't leave a lot of stranded assets, doesn't leave a lot of things that customers will have to ultimately pay for.
And really, you have to do all this without having it down. And what I mean by that is here in the DC area, we have Metro. And Metro delayed some of their repairs for a while. So this week I'm driving to work because Metro is being repaired. You can't do that with a grid.
Exactly.
And so what are any of the broader challenges that you face going from something that may be 100 years old in some places and making it go 50 years further out than we are right now? How do you do all that?
Yeah.
And anticipate things that weren't anticipated up to now and won't be anticipated till maybe another 10 or 20 years?
Absolutely. So planning, right, is really the key. And giving utilities as much line of sight into how these trends are happening and how it will impact them will only serve to benefit customers in the long run, because if they can incorporate these ideas and these technologies into their integrated resource plans today, then they can better manage for them in the future. That's how they develop all of these future build outs of their generation, their transmission, and their distribution services. And so we actually are moving towards, as an industry, towards what's called distributed resource planning, which is actually getting down to an even more granular level where we can see at the distribution level the uptake of these technologies behind the meter and planning around them and best practices for planning around them and being able to utilize them as grid assets.
Interesting. Now, I know a lot of things can change, and Jeff just talked about trying to look 20 years, 50 years in the future and planning with that. EVs aren't going away. We're never going to be here. But when things change, such as CAFE rules, maybe those won't go into effect as much as we think they will. Maybe it's extended a little longer. Does that change your planning? Or do you kind of just have your vision on, we're going to do this, and regardless of who's with us, we're going to make this happen?
Yeah, so there are certainly lots of variables
Right.
for a utility who's trying to plan. And they need to look not just at the local level, state, regional, even international and national. They need to know and understand what those trends are. I think that federal regulations, they have their place, but there's also a lot of state initiatives. For example, 64% of all EV sales to date have been in zero emission vehicle states. These are ZEV states that have different rules than the federal CAFE standards. 389,000 of those vehicles are in California. This is out of 875,000 EVs in the entire country. So the vast majority of these vehicles are in one state. Now, what we would anticipate happening is that as more auto manufacturers are making their vehicles available in more places, that we'll start to see those numbers grow in other states. But it is exciting to say that 51 models of EVs have been sold so far in this country. That's a huge number compared to where we were even just 5 years ago. And even more exciting is the price of lithium ion coming down so rapidly. So in 2013, it was close to $600 per kilowatt hour. In 2017, the price dropped to $209.
Yeah.
That's a huge drop, and it continues to decline. So I think that's a positive trend for the EV industry. It's a strong indicator that this technology is very robust and it will continue to grow. And especially this year in 2018, we've seen more and more vehicle sales than we've seen in any previous years. So I think we're starting to see the bottom of that hockey stick start to turn up.
Is there anything that you attribute that to? Because I know that, like, for instance, last year, sales were relatively flat from the year before, and a lot of that was attributed to gas prices being relatively stable. Mm-hmm. Now, they're about 50 cents higher than they were this time last year, but we're still about 40-some months into sub-$3 gas on a national level. Was it just that slight bump in national gas price, or was there just a year further on the cycle and a year more of that many more car models hitting? What is leading to this latest rise?
I actually don't have the answer to that. I think it's probably a lot of things. More consumer education on the part of the broader public as well as their utility members, I think might have something to do with it. But it might also be just the models are more in line with what people want. The first vehicles that were out and that were EVs were small, compact cars, which not a lot of consumers are buying, right? The consumers today want SUVs. They want bigger cars. Crossovers. And that is what we're starting to see from the EV industry, is being responsive to those larger car needs. And that's what the latest models are coming out and doing.
Now, are you still driving your Leaf, or did you go up to the Model 3, or what are we working with now?
I'm still working with the Leaf, yeah.
Okay, all right. You mentioned it was fun, and I know you like the torque on those. So EVs do have a little bit of torque that's kind of fun to play with, so I get you. Now, there's one thing I wanted to ask before we close out, and that was you have a electric vehicle working group, and I know communication, working with different stakeholders is going to be the biggest thing, no matter what we're really working on, talking to all the stakeholders. Can convenience store owners or retailers, can they be a part of this, and how would they get involved?
Yeah, so we would absolutely love to have convenience store retailers be part of our working group. They do have to be SEPA members to join, but anybody who's a member can participate. It's not restricted to a certain number of people within an organization. So, but that absolutely would be an essential voice that we would love to have participate in our work. We are doing some very exciting things right now on distribution planning for EVs, on managed charging, vehicle to grid. We also started a brand new group on incentives and tariffs. And finally, we're looking into battery electric buses.
There you go. Wow. And how would they actually get in touch with you, or who should they reach out to?
My contact information is on our website at www.sepapower.org.
Perfect.
Well, thank you, Erika. It was a great conversation. And thank you for listening to Convenience Matters.
Convenience Matters is brought to you by NACS and produced in partnership with Human Factor. For more information, visit convenience.org.